Good morning, everyone. I'm Jan Carlos Kucharek, editor of Products in Practice and deputy editor of the RIBA Journal. Happy belated New Year to all of you, and welcome to the first of our 2023 PiP webinars, today on the subject of housing and residential development. This seems to be a subject of interest to a great many of you, given the high number of registrations that we've received for this particular webinar. So I hope that you've all pulled up your chairs and have your tea at the ready, because we have assembled for you a truly engaging collection of projects, which I trust will provide inspiration for your own in this most engaging of sectors. Essential in as much as it provides for the most basic of human needs, shelter. Challenging from an architect's perspective, as some clients are not always committed to the most noble of its aspirations. And rewarding in the most fundamental sense, for when designed and executed with thought and skill, housing has the potential to sublimate urban living to the level of art. It came as no surprise for me to hear that some friends of mine, long-time residents of Neve Brown's Dunboyne Road flats in Camden, until his death in early 2018, counted the architect himself as a neighbour and friend. And what greater affirmation can an architect give to the housing he designed than making it his own home in his final years? That valedictory thought provides an ironic start to our PiP webinar with a development that may even be mentioned in the presentation of our opening speaker, who's an expert in all matters housing, being a social historian specialising in the subject. I reread yesterday a review I did of his 2018 book, Municipal Dreams, an authoritative account of the development of social housing in the UK that documents its aspirational rise through decades of selling off and underfunding, bringing us to the present parlous sea of inadequate low-quality housing, punctuated by small islands of genuine holistic housing approaches. Here to talk about the UK's historical and contemporary best, we have John Boughton, Honorary Research Fellow at the University of Liverpool's School of Architecture. He's actually written two books, Municipal Dreams, which I just mentioned, The Rise and Fall of Council Housing, and most recently, A History of Council Housing in 100 Estates by RIBA Books. Over the last 10 years, his blog at municipaldreams.wordpress.com has provided a record and history of our council housing across the country. In this highly illustrated survey, Boughton examines a remarkable history of social housing in the UK, with 100 examples from the almshouses of the 16th century to the 2019 Sterling Prize-winning Goldsmith Street. He chronicles its early charitable provision to homes for heroes, garden villages to new towns, tower blocks, and modernist developments to new sustainable housing. And he covers all the estates like Alton East and West, Becontree, Dawson's Heights, Donnybrook Quarter, Dunboyne Road, and Park Hill, from leading architects like Peter Barber, Neve Brown, Karasevich Carson, Kate McIntosh, and Michael Riches. Good morning, John.
Good morning, and thank you very much for that very nice introduction.
Thank you for attending.
Thank you for the invitation to speak. Thank you for the shameless plug for the book. And
not shameless at all. It's a great book. Well, Municipal Dreams is a great book.
Thank you.
Really wonderful, digestive read.
Great. And I'll draw your attention to the front cover of the new book, beautifully produced by RIBA Books. And some of you may recognise that scene. It's Alton East. It's actually a colorised photograph of a 1970 RIBA Pix image. Durford Crescent, if you want to go there today. And that's an important cover to me because I think it really represents a very positive view of council housing. I've tried to write in a clear-eyed fashion about strengths and weaknesses, what worked and what didn't work. But council housing, which housed 1 in 3 of the population at peak in 1981, has housed many millions of our citizens in decent, affordable surrounds. And Alton East, of course, as you see, is really one of the pinnacles of its achievement. So in this brief talk, I can really only kind of skirt around the subject or skim around the subject. But I guess what I've tried to do here, and it does draw out some of the themes and certainly the case studies within the new book, is to pick out some sort of major elements of council housing over its sort of almost 150-year history now. And obviously one of the major tensions in that history has been, and continues to be in fact, the conflict, as it were, between multi-story and low-rise housing, or as they would have termed it in the pre-First World War period, which is when council housing emerged as a significant element, the conflict between tenements and cottages. So I'm beginning, this is essentially, if you like, if nothing more, hopefully a collection of sort of nice and interesting pictures. So I'm beginning with a view of some of the major tenement schemes that I examined, pre-First World War tenement schemes, high school yards in Edinburgh. I won't talk you through them, but Millbank and Darcy buildings in Hackney, both built by the London County Council, which was always, of course, in the very forefront of both the design and provision at scale of council housing, as was actually the Tory Council of Liverpool. Council housing was, until 1979, a pretty cross-party endeavour, and that's one of the things I try to emphasise in my books and blog. Hornby Street, Liverpool, you can see on the bottom right, is actually 3-storey tenements. Now these typically, not in every sense, some are staircase access, but the most typical form of tenement block that certainly in London you'll be very familiar with in London are the 5-storey walk-up balcony blocks, almost ubiquitous in central London. 5 stories was the maximum judged feasible for a mother with child, maybe a husband in gender terms carrying the coal, etc., etc. But of course, no hope at that time for lift provision, other than in what then middle-class mansion blocks, of course. So tenements were a means, it was felt, of providing dense habitation within the inner city, close to work, etc. But the ideal was certainly the cottage and the garden suburb, taking its cue, of course, as you'll all know, from Ebenezer Howard and the Garden City movement, but expressed on a sort of smaller municipal scale in schemes across the country. Now, of course, actually on the left-hand side of the screen, Burnage Garden Village was not a municipal scheme. It was actually a co-partnership model, Manchester Tenants Limited, and rather beautiful it is, and it remains a co-partnership scheme to the present. I shared this image, the architectural drawing on the top left, on Twitter a few weeks ago, and everybody was very impressed. You won't be able to see it yourselves, but everybody was very impressed that it contained a cycle store, a little shed within the house at the front of the house. So maybe ahead of its time in that respect. Obviously, as you can see, this is high quality housing. The Flower Estate, Sheffield, that you shown in the middle, was a part of represented the Yorkshire and North Midland Cottage Exhibition. These are prize-winning cottages designed for that particular event organised by the National Housing Reform Committee. And the Old Oak Estate on the right-hand side, of course, is really the very acme, I think, of London, again, London County Council design before the First World War. Art and craft influence, and the kind of thing that would go on to inspire our next slide, our next topic, which of course is the sort of, in some respects, still the heyday of council housing, the so-called Homes for Heroes era, inaugurated after the First World War by the 1919 Housing Act, Christopher Addison's Housing Act. And, you know, all these estates that you can see exhibited there are essentially inspired by the Tudor Walters report, parlour homes of cottage appearance, to use his own description, with gardens front and back, and normally 2 or 3 bedrooms, 12 per acre, so low density. Raymond Unwin was actually the principal author of the Tudor Walters report, and of course Raymond Unwin, as an architect and planner, is a pretty storied figure in this history. I think the pictures speak for themselves. Moss Park, Glasgow is an interesting one because Scotland has a very powerful tenement tradition then and now. So this was really a kind of English importation in some respects. But equally, the Welsh example there by Ernest Morgan, borough architect at a time into the 1970s when so many architects worked in the public sector, shows you what was achieved by local government. But of course, the drive was always to house at scale. Typically, those homes for heroes and that early post-war housing was very expensive and almost too good in a sense to be built at scale. So what a lot of people will know is allegedly the largest council estate, the largest social housing estate in the world, Becontree, an enormous estate of some 112,000 population. Half of them were under 18 in the 1920s, 1930s, so it must have been a lively place, and around 25,000 homes. It gives you some idea that of the scale of ambition and enterprise in past times compared to obviously the paltry figures of social housing, social rent housing we're able to build now. Becontree, of course, was criticised for that scale and enormity, alleged uniformity. City of Mount Withenshaw, Barry Parker, the plan there you can see, was I guess a higher grade social housing estate, built with parkways and plentiful green spaces, neighbourhood units and so on. So it represented really the sort of almost a township in terms of its quality and overall design. So architects and sort of architectural gurus always sort of look to the British history of council housing and tend to be somewhat disappointed, certainly in the interwar period, by its rather sort of small c conservative style and appearance. So there were some examples of modernism. Sometimes the kind of form, the exterior betrayed the reality, which is still this 5-storey walk-up balcony access. But certainly on the left-hand side, the Oaklands estate, London County Council, as was the White City estate there. You know, this nod to the ocean liners of the day in this modern styling. White City estate was actually a move away, the new flat. You can see, probably not in sufficient detail, but the new flat staircase access in this case, sliding partition between the kitchen and dining room. And so a real attempt to modernise tenement living and make it more attractive. St Andrews flats in Liverpool, Lancelot Quay and Quarry Hill flats in Leeds were obviously, as you can see, an attempt to build at scale, but an attempt to build really a community. So not just those flats as illustrated, but a living community in terms of facilities, a wide range of facilities. Quarry Hill was also very innovative in its use of prefabrication, not unfortunately successfully so. It was eventually demolished in the 1970s. So this takes us up to the Second World War. And of course, that same drive, that same post-war aspiration, and indeed necessity, given sort of popular pressure and politics, to build well and to build scale, to house the British people far better than they had known previously. And you know, what emerges in 45 is actually, in some respects, very much a critique of what had developed before the Second World War. Becontree, for example, was criticised for its lack of community. Other similar estates were seen as sort of rather soulless and uniform. So there were several attempts to actually improve the nature and form of council housing, the council estate. Most notably, and this was Patrick Abercrombie's big idea, really the foremost planner of the era, the neighbourhood unit. And the exemplar of that, the avatar, was the Lansbury neighbourhood, built for the 1951 Festival of Britain, and designed, as you can see on that left-hand image, to be a complete neighbourhood, to be a self-sufficient neighbourhood centred on the catchment area of an elementary school, schools, churches, shops, pubs, etc. And it was believed that this would actually foster community and in some respects recreate what was allegedly being lost to the demolition of the slum terraces. neighbourhood unions were rarely kind of fulfilled to that degree of quality and ambition, but certainly, you know, just in the middle there, a more typical example, New Parks in Leicester, an interesting gibbered church, a rather attractive, though somewhat down a hill, shopping parade, and the estate pub, which was closed at the time of the photo. But gives you again the idea that housing was seen not in isolation, but as part of a community effort. Not many people probably know Stowlawn in Bilston in the West Midlands, but it's one of the most interesting estates, I think, in the book. Charles Riley, who was the retired professor of architecture at Liverpool, was its kind of inspiration. You can see his plan at the top. Village greens, Riley envisaged not only village greens, but community centres, food supplies, restaurant services, etc., etc. The full gamut. All of that was knocked on the head by the Ministry of Health and Housing. It's far too expensive, so you get a rather diluted version. But it's a fantastically interesting estate, I think, with some sort of residue of that history. So looking again, the other big idea to both improve the appearance of council housing and its offer, as it were, was the notion of mixed development. Not a kind of stunningly innovative or surprising idea, but the reality is that in the interwar period, nearly all council housing had been family housing, 2-3 bedroom family homes. And by 1945 and on, there was a realization that a wider range of the population, elderly people, elderly couples, single people and childless couples also needed council homes. And mixed development was an attempt, obviously, to provide a range of housing to those people in different stages of life, but it was also envisaged and embraced by architects as a means of providing a far more interesting and greater variety of housing forms and shapes. So obviously executed in exemplary fashion, deliberately exemplary fashion, in Hackney by Frederick Gibbard on the left, Somerford Grove, Gleadless Valley, Lewis Womersley, city architect at the time. Gleadless Valley is a fantastic estate, I think, in terms of its topography and location and range of housing. And then, of course, you get to a very, in a sense, corrupted view of mixed development, the kind of splurge, in a sense, that was erected on a huge scale in the mass housing movement of the 1960s. So that is a mixed development estate. You can see the high rise, you can see the lower rise, but without, I would say, a great deal of finesse. So moving on, other big post-war ideas, which I think, I find this interesting. It's often, it doesn't seem controversial to me, the idea that we should separate people and traffic. We'll come back to that, and to the extent it is controversial. But a couple of examples, or several examples here. One, of course, was the Radburn system, based on the New Jersey town, interwar town of the motor age, where housing was deployed across the greens and with service roads to the rear. Two good examples there. Parkhill, many of you will know, famous streets in the sky, deck access, seen at its best there, PiP's estate, Lewisham. A whole kind of upper story gangway between housing, shopping, off the ground shopping centre, old people home, etc., etc. That now has been demolished. And the North Peckham estate, which, as you can see on that plan, was essentially a series of walkways seen as a means, obviously, of providing community, of providing safe and easy access to housing, separate from the pollution and noise of roads. Multi-story, of course, becomes a necessity, becomes both to avoid the sort of sprawl of into rural areas, and to provide density, allegedly density, within the inner city. architectural design schemes, I think, of considerable merit here. LCC, London County Council, again on the left. The Aberdeen Multi is a really good example, listed in Scotland recently, and of course Kate Mackintosh's Dawson Heights. So some very fine examples, just a selection there of good quality, very extremely habitable multi-story housing. But of course, again, the ambition and drive to build at scale sees that corrupted in some sense. System building poorly executed in a British context is one issue, and then of course then just to build to drive high, although actually only in 1968 were 25% of new approvals high-rise over 6 stories. So in fact, between 45 and 79, 70% of housing, council housing, was 2-story. But of course, it is these eye-catching, sometimes impressive and attractive, sometimes rather problematic and flawed, these high-rise 31 stories Red Road, Sentinels Flats, 32 stories, just to beat one up on Glasgow from Birmingham City Council. Now, of course, by the 70s, for reasons I don't have time to go into, but you'll know some of them, I'm sure. Obviously, that high-rise ambition is squashed. Low-rise, high-density, Dunboyne Road, we've referenced that already. Neve Brown and Camden under Sidney Cook. Cressingham Gardens, low-rise, high-density, Ted Hollenby in Lambeth, and this rather interesting sort of less well-known perimeter planning estate, Dufferin in South Wales. So this was the new idea. As a corrective, it was perceived to the excesses of the 1960s. And finally, because I'm running out of time, is regeneration. We looked at the North Peckham estate, where it features somewhere in the middle of that image to the left-hand side, now demolished. And what we see, of course, with the new notion to defensible space, this sort of lionisation of the street and its virtues, legibility in design, this sort of clarity of public-private space, this whole defensible space movement, which hopefully you're familiar with. Of course, essentially is the demolition of deck access. The streets in the sky is seen as promoting antisocial behaviour and so on, and this recreation, this return to to what was seen as a traditional streetscape, low-rise streetscape, and indeed a sort of currently people talk about the abolition of the estate as such, the removal in various ways of the separation of public housing from the wider city. And I think that's where I should stop. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, John. That was fascinating. You're actually 3 minutes early. Typical, like absolutely wonderful, right, kind of swift run through UK housing, with all the kind of all the real touchstones of the UK housing history. Where do you think it all went wrong? Well, I always put that. So it's a very good question. I always put it in sort of scare quotes because it's a sort of it's a question it's a form of question I don't particularly like or try to. I'm sorry, it's a bit general, but no, it's a good question. It's a very good question, and I do address it. Obviously, you have to. I mean, I think what goes wrong, to the extent it does go wrong, I suppose. Sorry, just my hesitation around that phrase, of course, is that in many respects it didn't go wrong. Obviously, many millions of people lived good and decent lives in good quality council housing. But of course, stigmatization, media coverage, etc., focused on the negative. But what changed was certainly, obviously, it goes without saying, the sort of reduction of new build in the 1980s, right to buy, which sees between 79 and 97 sees about 1.4 million council homes lost to the private sector. So the jargon is, of course, the word applied is residualisation. It's that council housing, which certainly did broadly cater for a cross section of the community into the 1970s, increasingly becomes confined to those the most disadvantaged. And in that respect, of course, that
one has to be honest, will bring problems, of course, to those communities. And it also changes the image of council housing. So it becomes seen as housing of last resort, rather than as it was through most of its history, as aspirational housing, always a step up for many millions over that longer history.
But you were saying, because I mean, a lot of people attribute the kind of, well, let's just say the death of UK housing, in a real sense, to the whole kind of Thatcherist right to buy thing. But you were actually saying, I mean, certainly what I remember from Municipal Dreams is that you're actually saying that, as you say, the stigmatization of council housing was already happening well before then. When Thatcher kind of decided that she was going to start selling off homes, it was because there were already problems endemic there. She basically had a kind of no opposition at that point, because actually the housing stock had degenerated to such an extent. So the seeds were already there, weren't they, by the time she privatized it?
I think there were, yeah, yes, and absolutely. I try to be honest about this. There's no point in sort of being sort of rosy, looking at things through sort of rosy spectacles, as it were. Yeah, I mean, a lot is happening, so it's a big question. I mean, one thing certainly is the rise of owner occupation, working class owner occupation. From the 30s, but more powerfully into the 50s and 60s. So council housing, which was certainly sort of top of the tree, as it were, for most working class people, becomes slightly second rate, as it were, as a result of that. So there is an attitudinal shift, a psychological shift. I think, and I've never really been able to pin this down, but I think it's a really interesting question. I think there is actually a sort of cultural shift in the 1970s, a less deferential, more troubled society, and council estates typically sort of bore the brunt of that. So there is a rise of antisocial behaviour, etc. I think in the 1970s, which is problematic. And I think it's true to say also, well, certainly, obviously, some of that mass housing in the 60s was problematic in terms of certainly system building, which was flawed, and the scale and kind of overweening form of some of that housing was unattractive for people and unpopular. And finally, yeah, I mean, finally, it is true to say, I think, from the mid-70s, so before Thatcher, housing departments, council housing departments were managing their properties less well, investing less well, not, as all your listeners will know, you have to maintain houses, you have to maintain their investment in maintenance and so on. And that was not really done effectively. That was failing by the late 70s and becomes almost catastrophic, of course, with the public spending cuts of the 80s.
What, given the current situation, what kind of comfort do you draw from the state of UK housing at the moment? I mean, where do you kind of see lights? Yeah, it feels a bit, you go a bit tunnel vision in music. It kind of goes to I mean, for me, it went to quite a dark place. That it almost felt a bit hopeless at the end. But I'm sure that you do actually see kind of glimmers of light in, I mean, certainly in this book, you're looking at, Michael Richards, Donnybrook, there's obviously innovation occurring, isn't there? There are kind of bright sparks.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've just realised, actually, I missed the last slide.
I was going to say, you kind of, yes, you didn't mention.
Yeah, because I thought I was running slightly over. The last slide, of course, is headed sustainability. I won't try and go back to it now because it's probably too complicated. But it illustrates Wilmcote House in Portsmouth, which is a multi-storey, 1960s multi-storey slab block, which has been reconditioned, renovated to passive house standards. Goldsmith Street, of course, winner of the 2019 Sterling Prize. So sustainability, local authorities, housing associations are in the vanguard of building sustainable housing. So that's certainly not only a hope for the future, but actually a really important message for the future, an example for the future. I mean, local authorities are ambitious to build. They are building more. There has been a slight easing of finance and regulations, enabling them to do so, small scale compared to what we did in the past. But I think the will is there, but the political will on the ground is there, and then obviously we'll need to see what happens in Westminster as to whether that emerges on a larger scale. But it's certainly, to the architects listening, I mean, in the 1970s, 49% of architects, qualified architects, worked in the public sector. that always makes the students I talk to feel a bit kind of nostalgic, because I think there is an ambition to work for the public good nowadays. Always has been, of course, but it's encouraging to see, some really good architectural practices working on public sector housing now.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much indeed, John. We do actually have some comments. Marcus here said, was segregation possibly part of the problem? Smaller council house developments set within the wider community seem to work better, which kind of tallies more with how you're talking about modern approaches now, which tend to be kind of like, councils working on infill schemes really in existing schemes. Mm-hmm. So I think that probably picks up on that. Frank says the social housing problem was substantially more than image. I'm sure you'd have whole chapters to devote to that comment. And Marcus Ham is saying, well, thank you for a fantastic presentation and fascinating. And we've already ordered the book. So that's certainly one you've got there, John. I would personally say that if you do want to take a look at the history of council housing in hundreds of states, and I would really say take a look at it. I'm sure it's a fantastic book. I've yet to get my copy through yet. But given the presentation, I think it would be absolutely, please do order it. It's available at the RIBA bookshop. I think if you put PiP 20 in and the discount code, you'll even get 20% off, I think, Amber. My recommendation would be, if you think you can blag it with the PiP 20, see if you can get Municipal Dreams as well. It is a really amazing book. It's kind of concise, but somehow granular in its documentation of the history of UK housing. I don't know how he did it. John, it was a fascinating read. And I would definitely say double up on it, because it is both books will be amazing. Thank you very much indeed, John.
Thank you.
Now we go to our sponsor presentation for today's PiP webinar, which comes from VMZinc and Operational Marketing Manager, Jonathan Lowy. Hello, Jonathan.
Hello, Carlos.
How are you doing? Happy New Year to you.
Yes, very well, thank you. Yes, a belated Happy New Year to you too.
Well, we've emailed before, haven't we? We always say hello.
Yes, we have actually, indeed.
Jonathan, now you've got, I'll just give a brief, Jonathan's presented on a few occasions at these PiP webinars, but he has over 24 years of experience working with VMZinc. He's operated in technical and sales positions internationally, has an excellent understanding of not only the market needs, but also technical possibilities of zinc for roofing and cladding. He's also been involved in technical certifications like environmental profile declarations, EVA certifications and fire testing, and his knowledge was used to pen technical literature aimed at architects and installers. Before VMZinc, he was a land surveyor in Paris, ironically spending a lot of time on the city's zinc rooftops. Always a charming story, that one, Jonathan. Yes, you're always kind of like, always getting in touch with me after some of these things saying, whenever we do presentations on buildings, you always like say, that one had a VMZinc roof, can you like point that one out? So I will actually point out that, one of our presentations, which will be later on, well, it doesn't actually have a zinc roof itself, but the Magdalen College Library did have a zinc roof, which you did say, could you please kind of mention that at some point? It is a lovely roof, as indeed the rest of the building is lovely. And we'll be hearing from Holly later about another building done in Cambridge by Niall McLaughlin. But today you're talking on zinc in the housing and residential sectors over the last 170 years. That's going to be a very digested presentation, Jonathan.
It's going to be a quick run through.
I better let you go, because that's going to be quite quick. That's going to be quite a big deal. I think 170 years.
Yes, it's going to be. It's not going to be a minute per year, luckily. Right. So I sort of quite often start these presentations with the photo of Paris, not only because, as Carlos said, at one point in my career I worked on the roofs of them, but they are all zinc, and this was down to Napoleon III's town planner, Baron Haussmann, who was charged to take Paris from a medieval-looking city in the middle of the 19th century. It hadn't changed that much, narrow streets, steep roofs, quite a squalid place, into what was then the modern era. And on the right, you can see one of probably the largest construction sites that was Paris in about sort of mid 1850s. Baron Haussmann built these or planned these grand boulevards, which are pretty much still completely intact today. And as John previously said, there was a bit of sort of mixed use in a lot of these buildings. The bottom two floors, the ground floor and the first floor, were really business areas, and then the second, third, and fourth floors were, I suppose, the noble quarters, and the top floors were the servants' quarters. Now, obviously, there aren't too many of these buildings that have servants' quarters, but the top floors are often residential and clad in zinc. There's sometimes a combination of zinc and slate or just zinc, but 95% of these buildings have zinc on them. Something that I get asked quite often about is the acoustics of zinc, especially if you're going to be putting it directly above a bedroom. Well, nearly all these roofs are above bedrooms. Zinc is something that's relatively soft, not soft like lead, but it's much softer than steel and aluminium. And because it's fully supported, the amount of sound that you get from impact noise from rain or hail is actually very, very small indeed. So generally not really a problem. Just to show you sort of close up, because I've had a few conversations actually fairly recently about people thinking that sort of zinc's just standing seam. Traditionally, it's batten cap, which is not dissimilar to a lead roll. And on the left, you can see a U panel with a piece of timber and then a cap over the top. And that's the traditional way of doing zinc roofing. And sometimes it's used to replace lead roofs. Zinc and lead actually have a lot of similar characteristics. One of the big differences, though, is density and weight. A zinc roof will weigh about 7 kilos a square meter, whereas a lead roof would be close to 25 or more. And that's unfortunately one of the reasons why lead gets stolen. You don't need to steal very much to make it worthwhile. But stealing zinc, you'd have to steal an awful lot. So in reality, that never actually happens. And again, as the previous speaker, John, mentioned, especially around Paris or a lot of French cities, there's been some housing estates which have not been maybe the most successful socially speaking around the edge of Paris. This photo is in Aubervilliers, which is a fairly working class northern suburb of Paris, and it was actually a 1920s building which has been redeveloped, extended upwards and sideways, and then the buildings that I think there were about 15 affordable units, and this has been clad in a combination of anthracite, which is dark zinc, and timber by Pietri Architects. Again, there's been a bit of a desire to reduce building heights, going from very tall 20, 25 plus story buildings to a lower rise. Still quite high density, but lower rise. Moving to the UK, this is a development in Manchester called Lampwick Quay by Callison RTKL Architects that was finished about a year ago now. Larger scale, 213 units this time. And it uses, from the zinc perspective, it uses a combination of systems and finishes. Zinc is generally grey, but there was a desire by the architects to highlight some of these areas, and a gold zinc was used. One of the advantages of zinc over other materials is it's very malleable and flexible. So you can sort of clad tricky flashings and details with zinc when maybe some other stiffer materials are a bit trickier. But here you see a combination of the pre-weathered quartz zinc and the coloured gold zinc using standing seam and rain screen systems. Moving a bit further south, this is a Fair House in Winchester by Anthony Munden. Obviously a very different scale. This is a private house in a conservation area where a palette of fairly traditional materials have been used. But again, the roof is anthracite standing seam, which combines very effectively and quite simply with the flint and the brick on this house, as I said, in Winchester. Just a quick word, I'm not going to go into great detail, but just a quick word on build-ups. Zinc is something, whether it be used on a roof or a wall, that should last 100 years or possibly more. There are examples of zinc roofs and walls over 100 years old, but that means that the substrate has to be correct. Now, both cold roofs and warm roofs are possible. On the right, you see a cold roof, which is fairly traditional timber substrate with a vented cavity, and that works extremely well. And on the left, you see a warm roof, non-ventilated build-up, where there's no cavity between the zinc and the insulation. There's a substrate with a vapor barrier, rigid insulation, a breather membrane, and zinc. Quite often get asked which one's better. There isn't really a better one. It's sort of horses for courses. It depends very much on the design. Obviously, a warm roof it's easier to avoid thermal bridges, so there is that advantage. But not every single roof is going to be a warm roof. So it really depends on the design in question. As you saw on the previous slide, we talked about timber. For walls, for example, the project in Manchester Lampwick Quay required non-combustible substrates, residential building over 18 meters. It's quite straightforward to replace the plywood or timber substrate with a galvanized steel deck. The zinc itself is A1. It can become A2 with some coatings, but that's still quite acceptable. It's non-combustible or limited combustibility. So it's fairly straightforward to create an A1 stroke A2 wall build-up with zinc. Moving out of Europe, this is I feel quite a spectacular project. This is a building or house in the Lebanon, Mount Lebanon, called On the Rocks. I think you can probably see why. It's at 1,600 meters altitude, and the whole design sort of really fits well with the environment. The anthracite roof and the concrete and the glazing. And on this slide on the left, you can literally see the idea of it's obviously a blown up image, but the idea is that the zinc roof sort of floats above the building quite effectively. And this is a project by Karim Nadia Design. It's nice to see quite an interesting building in such an unfortunately war-torn part of the world. Back into Europe, this is a residential building in Zurich in Switzerland. It's a sort of area of Zurich which has a very eclectic group of buildings. So this one fitted in quite well. It uses this one pigmento green and pigmento grey, which is zinc with a mineral pigment that's added, giving a slight greenness, as you can see on the facade of this building. It's a bit like looking at zinc through tinted glasses. And here you can see how the panels fit together. It's actually very simple. Rain screen panels. It's installed bottom to top, and this design was by Menzi Bergler Kaufmann Architects, and they use 14,000 of these little pieces, these sort of shingles, to create this textured facade. And just sort of going backwards, not quite to the middle of the 19th century in Paris, but going back about sort of 17 years or so. This is a project by Shepherd Robson, City Quarter for Berkeley Homes, that was done in about 2006. And on the architects combined natural zinc, dark anthracite, and quartz zinc in a rain screen. And on the right, you can see at the sort of top, the dark anthracite And just below that, there's the natural zinc. And on the right, the quartz zinc. And the natural zinc, which starts off as shiny, forms this patina. The photos there were taken at an interval of about sort of 7 or 8 years, and the natural zinc is almost got to its quartz color, whereas the quartz and anther have changed almost not at all. And another look back in time a little bit. This is a project by Brady Mallow Architects, which this project was done Lampwick Street in Islington. It's again fairly high density housing around a public courtyard. This uses again the quartz zinc, and really the only thing that's changed here is the vegetation, which has grown a little bit. This building was completed in about 2009. So that's been a really quick run through a few projects. As I said, one of the advantages of zinc is the durability. Zinc is expected to last 100 years. There's a number of examples. All the systems, roof systems, have B-roof T4, non-combustibility and non-flame penetration and non-flame spread. So they can be used on buildings that require that. If you do need any assistance in design, we'd be happy to look at that. One important thing is installation. Zinc is a great material, but it does require good installation. Certainly, if you want it to last any amount of time and still looking good. We have a list of recognised installers. And we have a program of VMZinc at Work partners that can offer a 50-year material warranty. So that is something that's very important. We would always recommend that a recognised installer fits zinc. Zinc is not something that can be installed by a general builder. I think I'm going to hand back to Carlos now.
Thank you very much.
If you have or anybody has any questions at all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. You kind of skirted from 170 years ago all the way to the modern day, Jonathan.
I cheated a little bit, yes.
Thank you very much indeed for that. It was nice to see those examples. I particularly liked seeing that Lebanese project, really beautifully. I mean, just, the very fact that you could kind of look at that building immediately and kind of realize that the roof is doing that, expressly that purpose. Everything else moves underneath it and the roof just floats above. Really beautiful project. I've not seen that one. I suppose, my technical question, because you did go into some technical aspects there which were interesting. Just as a general rule though, could you tell me what affects the fire rating of the zinc sheet? It seems to be that the general thing is if you give it a colour coating, that may affect it. Is that correct or not?
Right.
Or is it that simple?
It pretty much is that simple. Zinc itself is a metal and is non-combustible. And all this is solid pure zinc. And a lot of those products that you saw are natural zinc or quartz zinc or anthrazine, and that is just zinc which has nothing added. Some of them are chemically treated, but then nothing's added. We can add a pigment, and you saw the project in Switzerland, which has the green pigment, and that's sealed with a coating. Now that coating takes the material from an A1 to an A2 classification. So it goes from non-combustible to limited combustibility. That's what's happening there.
Okay, it's just as a kind of rule of thumb for people if they're concerned about that, which they obviously will be. Someone's asking a question: how does zinc fare in coastal locations?
Very good question. There are quite a few projects. I'm not sure they only go back 170 years, but certainly back to the mid-early of the 20th century, where zinc was used on pier buildings. It was actually used on a previous Stirling Prize winner, Hastings Pier, but that's relatively new. Clacton Pier has a zinc roof, which I believe was installed in about 1950. So zinc actually performs extremely well by the sea. The only slight issue is on non-rinse surfaces. You can get some salt staining. It's not really corrosion as such. It's just where salt is sort of landing on the zinc and nothing's rinsing it off. So there can be aesthetics on some aesthetic issues on soffits when you're right by the sea. But as far as corrosion, zinc performs extremely well in extreme coastal environments.
There's another couple of questions. I will ask them both. One's from Corrine. She says, I understand timber runoff has an effect on zinc and many designers use both these materials on projects.
Yes. If you use timber with a low pH, sort of things like sweet chestnuts, red cedar, those will leach out and stain the zinc. So there are ways of avoiding that using things like you could use thermo wood. It only affects situations where the timber is directly above the zinc and water is running over the timber onto the zinc. Side by side, there's no issue. But there are, if you're designing something where water is going to run from timber to zinc, very acidic timbers should be avoided. So that's correct, yes.
Well, that's a good bit of advice. Thank you very much, Kareem. And Sam Marner's asking, as far as I'm aware, zinc has a high embodied energy value, but at the same time is highly recyclable. Does the latter aspect offset the former?
And that's quite a tricky one to answer. I mean, metal generally has a relatively high embodied energy. Zinc does have the advantage of being, when we produce zinc, it's through electrolysis. Now, some metals need basically the soup where you put the anode and cathode in to be, that soup to be heated up. Zinc is done at room temperature, so there's no additional energy to warm that up. But you do need the electricity to go from the anode to the cathode to produce the zinc. So there is that element of embodied energy, but lower than some metals. But as the person who asked the question said, you're offsetting that against not only a long lifespan of potentially over 100 years, but once that is actually it's replaced, that zinc is never thrown into landfill. It has a value. In Western Europe, about 98 or 98.5% of all old zinc is reused, is recycled. There's almost none. Now, some of that goes into new zinc sheet, some of it might go into brass production, some might go into galvanizing, but almost none of it is thrown away. So yeah, there is a little bit of an offset there.
Okay, well, Deborah's saying that the residential buildings in Hastings and Wellington Square are still using zinc and it looks great. Someone else is saying that the Chan Centre in Vancouver still looks great after 30 years. I'm going to ask you for yes or no answers to these two questions. First one, is zinc suitable for hot climates because it gets hot here in Cyprus, up to 45 degrees?
Yes.
Great. Next one, in the natural state, zinc is self-healing when scratched. Is this true for pigmento finish?
Yes. Can I just add a tiny little bit?
Qualify it, go on.
Well, there's no, when you scratch the green pigmento, it won't go green again. That scratch will not go green, but that scratch will not create any corrosion points. So it's sort of, there is a halfway.
Yeah, it's kind of yes and no.
Yeah, sorry. I mean, I'd be happy to, if anybody wants sort of more in-depth answers,
you can kind of do it in the chat.
Do it in the chat.
Or get in touch with you directly, indeed.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll be happy to try and answer those questions in more detail if needed.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Lovely presentation. Obviously, brought a lot of questions, so I think you're going to have to look at the chat because there are people asking more questions. But we do need to move on. Thank you very much indeed. We are now moving on to our next presenter, who's Holly Galbraith, who's an associate at Niall McLaughlin Architects. And she's going to be talking about the Master's Field Development in Cambridge. Holly joined Niall McLaughlin Architects in 2014, becoming an associate in 2020, and is involved in the practices of higher education schools and private residential projects. She also leads the Professional Development Working Group and contributes to management of the firm's recruitment, new business and bids, as well as being part of its IT BIM and implementation working group. God knows how you get a building design. Prior to joining the practice, she worked at several design-led practices in London and qualified as an architect with experience in housing, education, and cultural sectors. The 2021 Master's Field Development at Balliol College. Oh, Balliol is a master plan of 8 purpose-built student accommodation buildings. Balliol is Oxford, isn't it?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yes, sorry. A visiting professorial flat and a sports pavilion. The buildings frame a series of new landscapes, including quadrangles, tree-lined paths, and planted borders, and enables the college to accommodate its entire undergraduate intake on site. The project forms just one of over a dozen Oxford projects that Niall McLaughlin Architects have currently on site or have completed, not least of which is the 2022 Stirling Prize-winning Magdalen College Library. Take it away. Good morning, Holly.
Morning. Hi, everyone. Yes, I'm going to talk to you about the Master's Field Development for Balliol College, which was finished a few years ago and started as a project with the college in about 2015. This is one of my favourite images of the project. I think it sort of captures the essence of the scheme, which is a project about new student residences set within landscapes. The Master's Field Development is a project for Balliol College. The site is about 10 to 15 minutes walk from Balliol's main site, which is here, that sort of occupies a frontage along Broad Street, which is part of the historic core of Oxford. Those familiar with Oxford will recognise some of the buildings in the roofscape here, the Bodleian, the Sheldonian, and then the Western. The site is interesting because it's sort of proximate to the civic core of Oxford, and then also the larger University Parks developments, which occupy the north, and a lot of the parkland setting to the east of the site. As was mentioned a moment ago, as an office, we're really fortunate to have worked in Oxford for a number of years, and the Master's Field Development joins a series of these projects. One of the earliest to be completed was some student residences for Somerville College as part of the Radcliffe Observatory Master Plan. We also delivered the Sultan Nasruddin Shah Centre for Worcester College, again, another project that occupies the edge of a cricket pitch, similar to the Master's Field Development, which is just here at the bottom of the sheet. We've got a few projects currently at sort of tender and planning stage in North Oxford, one for University College, which is identified by the 7. That should be starting on site in the next few months. And we've just submitted for planning a hybrid scheme for a college and Oxford University along Winchester Road, which is here where my cursor is. This map is useful because it highlights, I guess, the site's geographical position, hugging this sort of edge of the civic core, and then the sort of expansive landscape to the east. To the north, you can see the larger scale of institutional buildings, and then to the east, those of you familiar with Oxford will recognise Arne Jacobsen's St Catherine's College building here. When we were introduced to the site, we were sort of mindful of its historic setting. There's a series of listed buildings proximate to the site itself, and then Holywell Street, which is one of the oldest streets in Oxford. We've got the Grade 2 star listed Law Library by Sir Leslie Martin in the northeast corner of the site. Holywell Manor, which is Grade 2 listed, which is the graduate facilities, and then St Cross Church, which is a Grade 1 listed building currently hosting the college's archive centre. And I guess the project was always going to need to reconcile a series of very different and disparate architectural conditions around the edge of the site. I've introduced you to the buildings on the left a moment ago. We've got the stone, the buff coloured stonework of the church. Again, a similar buff brickwork that was used by Leslie Martin in the Law Library. And then there's a scheme developed in the late 90s, early 2000s by McCormack, Jameson and Pritchard, which has a very strong yellow brick, and that sort of sits in close proximity to the site along the south. Another interesting condition of the project when we were introduced to it from the college was a series of unrealised master plans that had been proposed for the site over the years. I guess starting at the north was the master plan by Leslie Martin for multiple buildings at the northern part of the site. What was interesting here is that the buildings to the north cascade along the arc of the road towards the church, stepping back and forth with the library. There was obviously some kind of dialogue that the architect was trying to set up there with the library development and then the future propositions to the north. Similar to the south, the scheme by MJP was envisaged as a much larger development. They continued the rhythm of buildings and promontories that would follow the arc of the cricket pitch. So when we were asked to develop a series of student rooms for the college, we were mindful of the sort of the layers of history on the site and how we could make nods and take cues from those. Particularly the buildings at the north, they're larger in footprint, and we slip and slide them backwards and forwards towards Zinc Cross Road in dialogue with the library. Where the library pushes into the site, we recede a building. Where the library building recedes, we nudge the buildings forwards, and we mimic this cascading of building gables towards the corner of Manor Road. Similarly, we were interested in looking at the gaps between buildings. The scheme itself provides 225 study bedrooms, a 3-bedroom professorial flat, which occupies the top floor of this building in the south, a new sports pavilion, which anchors the centre of the plan. And then there is also planning permission for an assembly building at this corner, which will provide facilities for the graduates as part of an extension of Holywell Manor. This is very much a project about buildings that form the edges of streets, and is also sensitive, I guess, to the material scale of the historic context. Most of the buildings are 3 stories. Where they're in proximity to residential buildings, we step the buildings back from the street and introduce garden frontages to act as a bit of defensible space to the residences and mimic this garden-lined frontage that occupies the south of St. Cross Road. To the north, where the buildings sit closer to the street edge, we elevate the bedrooms. This acts as an acoustic buffer from the street noise, and we've also got enhanced acoustic glazing and trickle ventilation in the windows here as well. Here you can see what I was describing earlier on plan, this series of cascading gables as you move southwards along St. Cross Road, which also sets up a framing of the gable of the church. Another key aspect of the scheme was looking at the sort of the scale and massing of the buildings and how we could introduce gaps between the buildings. Historically, college developments are fairly introverted, often set behind high walls, which offers limited public interaction with this sort of private inner world beyond. This scheme, we wanted to sort of flip that narrative and maximise the sort of site's proximity to the parkland settings to the east, and also look to pay homage to the sort of rhythm of buildings and gaps between buildings that the MJP scheme had set up in the late 90s. Each of the buildings' footprints are relatively small, which allows us to break the massing up with a series of gaps between the buildings that offer long views through to the site, both to the gardens that we've created and towards the cricket pitch. You'll have seen this image, I think, which is at the start of the presentation, which is one of those gaps looking across the new undergraduate southern quadrangle, framing a significant veteran beech tree and a view towards the cricket pitch beyond. At each of the gaps between the buildings, we also look to plant trees around the arc of the cricket pitch, which is also a nod to the village green for sort of Sunday cricket playing. Collectively, these buildings are then grouped as clusters of buildings around the new landscapes that we've created. Buildings are close to the street edge to the south. They recede along the eastern ledge with those gardens that we saw earlier, and then they step backwards and forwards in dialogue with the larger scale of buildings towards the north. In terms of the plan and the brief, the college asked us to consider an architecture that could reduce social isolation. And when we thought about the life of students, we imagined this gathering, social gathering and interaction at the heart of the student daily life. We placed the idea of students around a dining table and then looked to cluster rooms around this social gathering space. We then sort of took that notion of that spatial arrangement that we'd created within each of the clusters and looked to arrange buildings radially around communal gathering spaces, in this instance, an external quadrangle. At the centre of each of the clusters, we widened the corridors. This allowed us to create sort of dining and social spaces. It also allows us to recess the entrances into each of the private study bedrooms within this sort of niche, offering a bit of a private threshold, I guess, between the corridor space and the bedroom itself. Each of these clusters comprises a glazed link at the end of the corridors, offering views out across the landscape and obviously flooding these shared spaces with light. We painted each of these clusters in calming colours and elevated the ceilings to announce this sort of central social space. We then scaled that up as a sort of a spatial arrangement around a series of buildings to create a necklace of clusters that are all linked through the glazed gable ends, building to building. It also allowed us to keep the building footprints fairly modest and maximise the quantity of dual aspect bedrooms that we could have at the corners. Each of the rooms are fairly simple in terms of their fit out. They're all individual study bedrooms with an ensuite bathroom pod typically. And a range of furniture that can support both the sleeping function of the room and study. Each bedroom also comprises a window bench for sort of resting. And this is an example of one of the early visuals we mocked up for the college showing one of the dual aspect bedrooms. This is a photograph on the left of my colleague Joanna, who was recreating one of Neil's early sketches to the right-hand side of your screen after a long day of inspecting the joinery furniture on site. Externally, each of the study rooms is represented within a brick face precast bay. The bedroom itself is recessed back within the depth of the piers. And then there's also a woven motif panel that sits between the two windows. All windows are openable on these elevations for natural ventilation into the bedrooms. This woven motif acts as a bit of a dividing panel between the bed and the study area. This is a view of one of the rooms from the inside. Neil's really interested in the early origins of architecture, particularly early notions of enclosure and this idea of sort of craft and weaving to create lightweight tapestries that would have historically been hung as space dividers and then eventually manifest themselves as walls. Here for the Master's Field project, we took this idea of a tapestry that could act as a dividing element between the zones of sleep and study and express this literally with a woven motif. The panels themselves support the gravity loads and the downward movement of those across the spandrels and the sills as well. But because we've recessed those back from the piers, I guess their tectonic functionality becomes deliberately ambiguous. Locally, the motif takes its cues from the frieze of the Ashmolean, also in Oxford, designed by Cockrell. We work extensively with mock-ups generally, and on this project we worked in close collaboration with a series of specialists, Thorpe Precast being one of those, who were responsible for the brick face precast elements and the woven motif on this project. Here was one of the facade bays that they'd mocked up in their factory that we then relocated to site, and we used that to test interfaces, junctions, all of the exciting stuff like movement joints and so on. We also expedited one of the installs of the facade bays on site in situ, which gave the college an opportunity to get a sense of scale of each of these study bedrooms. In the room beyond, the internal fit out was also expedited so the college could understand the general spatial intentions of the room and the fit out. The piers themselves are 3 bricks deep, and we've receded the glazing line back within the depths of these. This offers, I guess, the user privacy from the passing public realm and footfall across the site. Yet when you read these sort of piers on the oblique, they taper towards a thinness to 1 brick, thick at the nose, and then also you'd have seen in the photograph of the room earlier, a tightly configured corner in the interior. And then we took these sort of series of components, both the brick piers, the cobbled brick piers and the precast motif, and we replicated that around the site, creating a series of rooms that are stacked and clustered. We enjoy, I guess, the use of the piers when read on the oblique. It gives a more solid appearance to the envelope and the elevations that isn't otherwise noticed when you look at them straight on. And I'll wrap up this presentation with an introduction to the sports pavilion, which sits at the centre of the site. This is a single-storey cricket pavilion for spectating of the sports on the cricket pitch, and also houses a squash court and changing facilities for the matches. It's a simple building in footprint. It comprises 4 timber-clad cassettes to the rear of the plan, and they sit under an intricate timber lattice roof, both internally, and then that extends around the perimeter of the plan to form a covered canopy for external cricket viewing. We created glazed links within the between each of those timber cassettes that link up to clairvoyers within the garden walls of the residences to the rear that offer long views through the building and out towards the cricket pavilion. The envelope is predominantly glazed. We use generous sliding glazed windows. These are Schuko systems that open out onto this covered terrace for viewing the sport both from inside and outside. The main hall itself features a series of stacked sweet chestnut timber lattices that was developed by engineers Smith and Woolwick and realised with Inwood and Xylotech as the specialist fabricators. Within the lattice itself, we house a series of integrated lighting units that offer the client an opportunity to customise the lighting settings to host a range of functions. And I'll land here on the image of the main hall, looking across this sort of repeating stacked timber lattices. That's okay.
Thank you very much indeed, Holly. That was a whistle-stop tour of Masters Field. It was fantastic. Thank you.
Thanks.
I was really intrigued by the, I really like the kind of macro and micro approaches that you have, and the fact that I loved the stepping of the piers in the same way as it seems to reflect the actual stepping of the whole building in plan. And that's that lovely kind of reflection of one with the other in detail and on the bigger scale of the project itself.
Yeah, I mean, that was something we were really interested in, like how can you create sort of buildings and a building envelope that responds to the needs of the users within the space, offering them privacy from quite a busy public realm, but also considering the buildings as part of a wider placement within a historic context. How can each of the buildings around the site respond to their adjacent neighbours and buildings, offering something both to the public realm and then I guess to the users internally. We like as an office a deep facade generally. Steps Shamford reveals is something that we enjoy and we explore on a range of our projects.
Yeah, it's true, because I mean there is that kind of, because there's always been the town and gown thing, and I suppose now with modern architecture it's a matter of time to, traditionally those colleges, as you say, have always looked inwards. So the idea that, within the modern day that, it's now a requirement that these buildings also look out as well as looking in, it kind of, there's a kind of slight dichotomy there, because I suppose you want to respect the tradition, but at the same time, you're trying to kind of contribute to the urban realm rather than just turning your back on it.
Yeah, and it's certainly the planners encouraged. I mean, the college were also really supportive of creating both a secure line that was sort of visually permeable to the public realm, but considering these buildings as part of sort of the landscape setting and offering sort of the visual enjoyment of the landscapes, the tree planting and the cricket pitch to that public realm. It's quite an interesting location in Oxford because it sort of straddles the historic core, which is sort of buildings that sit on a street edge, very high brick walls. You have to go through Porter's Lodge gates to actually access these inner worlds of these quadrangles and courtyards, depending if you're in Oxford or Cambridge. And this site actually, I guess, starts to move into the residential areas where you have buildings with gardens, and we kind of wanted to play, I guess, on that duality.
We've got a question from Conway. He says, thank you, Holly, very interesting project and design approach, including choice of materials. Could you tell me what the energy performance of the project is? Do you know its operational energy performance?
Not off the top of my head. I didn't mention actually in the presentation itself, like obviously the buildings are clad in the brick face precast, but the overall structural strategy is the use of cross-laminated timber frames. That was one of the early and conscious decisions by the design team and the client to look at a framing method that would have a low embodied carbon, the use of the timber, and then obviously allow us to use a much more lightweight substructure, taking sort of a lighter load of the facade. I can certainly find out the eventual operational carbon data and pass that on to the question.
Thank you. And so Luke Turner's asking, will you be the architect for the assembly building on the important Vista Street corner?
Oh, we'd certainly like to be part of it. I think the college are considering a feasibility study for that now. So I hope so. We prepared a design for planning for that. It was one of the sort of sites that was of key interest to Oxford City Council. So hope so.
I was also thinking that most of those student rooms are dual aspect, are they not?
Yeah, that's
Yes.
correct. Yeah.
I suppose that's why people are kind of interested in the energy performance, because there are large expanses of glass there. Were there any sensitivities to, because I know that in some student projects that, are they tilt and turn windows? They don't open out, because I think there's sensitivities to kind of like, you know, mental health and well-being, and that they don't want windows fully opening in student rooms. Is that the situation here?
Yeah, that is true. Yeah, all of the Windows 1 restrictors, the twin windows are top hung. They open out to 100 mil on restrictors, and the side hung windows do the same. It's certainly going to be an interesting challenge, I think, going forwards when you're looking to ventilate buildings naturally, whether windows are an appropriate form of that going forwards with new Part L, because of these safeguarding restrictions that are in place for residences, and particularly student residences.
Yeah. Well, Deborah Phillips says it's beautifully conceived and presented. Taz Nazir is saying, great presentation, Holly, beautiful scheme, well done. Frank says it's beautiful. Lots of Gillian and Hanley saying beautiful. It's obviously very beautiful. Andrew says, beautiful project. What was the built cost per square metre? I know there's a lot of sensitivities around that, because I was trying that one for Magdalene and no one ever gives you the figures. Yeah,
no, it's sort of in a range between sort of £3,500 to £5,000 a square metre several years ago, I think. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for your presentation. It was fantastic. Well done. Beautiful project, as indeed everybody else said. I think we're going to now have a break. I'm running slightly over time. Sorry, it's just been, I'd rather go on. We're now 10 minutes late, but I hope everybody's staying with us, because it's a really fascinating presentation, and we have a couple more to come. So we'll take a 5-minute break, and we'll be back at 10:20. Thank you very much. Welcome back, everybody. I hope you've grabbed yourself a cup of tea again. We're now in the second half of our presentation, which should technically be finishing at 11 o'clock. But as you can see, we're already running late, 10 minutes, so it may be slightly later. But our next presentation is going to be from John Pardy Architects and Carl Gulland, who's project architect there. And he's going to be talking about their project Lovedon Fields in Hampshire. Carl's been a director at JPA since 2016, leading a team working on larger residential schemes for clients, including HAB Housing, Inland Homes and Q Developments. Projects include renovation and reuse and site additions to a Grade 2 1936 film laboratory building in Denham by Walter Gropius, as well as Lawn Road, 72 apartments in Belsize Park, adjacent to the iconic Wells Coates designed Icecon flats. Before joining JPA, Carl worked with Field and Clegg Bradley Studios on projects including at Cordia in Cambridge and Icon in Street. Lovedon Fields is 50 houses and apartments to developer HAB, which forms a new village edge to Kingsworthy, Hampshire, and is a winner of a RIBA National Award and was shortlisted for the Neve Brown Award for Housing. With views towards the South Downs National Park, new dwellings are arranged around a green and a lane, and house types take clues from local rural buildings, rows of cottages, small holdings, gable end on the road, the threshing barn. Homes provide a backdrop to a public realm designed to encourage interaction and community with doorstep benches overlooking roof terraces, calm shared surfaces, and informal meeting and play areas. Excuse me. Carl, are you there?
I'm here. Thanks, Carlos.
Hello. Well, we look forward to your presentation, Lovedon Fields.
Great. Thank you for the introduction. You've done a lot of the background for me, so I'll be able to skip through some of these slides quite quickly, which is good because I've got a lot of them. So apologies for going at quite a pace. Also apologies for the rather echoey sound. I hadn't realised, but because we work in a barn in the New Forest, we've got tall ceilings, and I don't think the sound is quite as good as some of the other speakers. So apologies.
Don't make us jealous, Carl.
So, as Carlos mentioned, Lovedon's 50 dwellings on the edge of the village of Kingsworthy. 40% of those are affordable, and the site was being looked at as part of the Winchester local plan at the time that we submitted the planning. It was in the process of being allocated. The overall site is a 7-hectare field, which was arably farmed. But in order to retain a strategic gap between Kingsworthy and the neighbouring village of Abbotsworthy. Only 2 hectares of the site was designated for built development, and the remaining 5 hectares was gifted in perpetuity to the village as an extension to their parkland, their Eversley Park. So 2 hectares and 50 dwellings, it's 25 dwellings per hectare, which to those of you used to building in urban environments sounds very modest indeed. But in the context of a village where the historic heart of a village is often 8 to 10 dwellings per hectare, and later development perhaps nudging 15 dwellings per hectare, to increase that density to 25 dwellings, although we didn't realise this at the time, was quite a significant ask, and to do that and maintain an appropriate character for a rural edge was also the challenge on this project. As Carlos mentioned, this developer for the site was HAB. HAB stands for Happiness, Architecture and Beauty, and was founded in 2007 by Kevin MacLeod and Isabel Allen with the strapline, "We build homes and places that respect the local context and biodiversity, are strongly rooted in history, landscape and the community, and are sustainable, beautiful and a pleasure to live in." A paragraph that could have come from the recently published National Design Guide, but at the time that it was written back in 2007 stood out as something different from how most house builders perceived their job in developing sites. Amongst other projects that HAB delivered, probably the best known is the Triangle in Swindon by Glenn Howell's Architects, and that captures some of those qualities that strapline describes. Isabel Allen, prior to being at HAB, was editor at the Architects Journal and championed a lot of John's early projects, including the Duckett House here in the New Forest. And it was that article that first registered with me that John Pardee Architects was a practice that I was interested in the work they were doing, their approach to a rural vernacular. And so I wrote to John on that as a result of that article, and inquired about the possibility of joining the team. So Kingsworthy, we started looking at this back in 2014, and the site sits a mile or so north of Winchester and is on the edge of Kingsworthy, which is in itself within a cluster of villages collectively known as the Worthies, and also adjacent to the South Downs National Park. It's gently sloping to the south, and just to the north you can see that the site connects to the built settlement of Kingsworthy, but really on most of edges we're facing onto green, be it the park or be it farmland or woodland beyond. And so, as I mentioned, the 2 hectares in this rather odd shape was the site that Winchester agreed should be allocated for built development. And in reality, the master planning of it was extremely straightforward. There was only one location on Lovedon Lane where we could take an access because of visibilities, and that happily sat in the middle of the longer part of the site. So we were able to put a lane through the middle that then continues and connects into paths and tracks that lead into the village. To the north, we wanted to create a green heart, a green centre for for this new community that would be populating the site. And so we very simply arrived at this diagram for a lane with plots to either side and a green triangle surrounded by dwellings that overlook it. And this is the after a number of iterations, but actually very quickly we arrived at this configuration and this mix of housing. And you'll start to see on this image, the orientation of the houses was key, and the reason that they're orientated away from, not aligned with the street, but orientated perpendicular to the street, was this idea of a rural edge that is perforate, that allows gaps and views through. Ooh, it's not letting me move on. Let's hold on a sec. Sorry. There we go. So just going back to the green heart of the development. It's a hard-working space overlooked by a lot of the dwellings. It's a place for play, for meeting. It's providing a number of different types of habitat. It's also functioning as part of the SUD strategy, the drainage strategy for the site. And if that green triangle is the heart of the scheme, then perhaps the meadow beyond is the lungs of the scheme, and a network of paths meander around the meadow and provide a really great breathing space, both for the residents of the new scheme, but also for the wider community. As I say, this space was gifted to the village in perpetuity, along with facilities, including allotments and natural play areas and a bike park. Some of those are yet to be delivered, and they fall in the council's remit. So we looked at 4 village house typologies to populate the development. One being the big house, maybe the rectory or the doctor's house. You get a number of these in most villages, and we located those in 3 key points at key thresholds around the site. You also get a lot of short rows of cottages, workers' cottages, and those sit round the green. Most of these are part of the affordable provision on the site, and they're all 2- and 3-bedroom houses. Some of them are market houses as well. And then another typology that we looked at is the threshing barn, and this is immediately outside of our studios here, and this provided the inspiration for the apartment building, believe it or not. But hopefully you can see the idea of the 2 stair cores, which are glazed at either end, providing access to six apartments. And again, those are part of the affordable provision. And again, this was one of the key things for HAP, was that the affordable provision should be located in the best locations, or good locations within the site. So the apartments here sit overlooking the green and with views out towards the South Downs. But the main typology, 24 of the dwellings on the site, was actually inspired by some village properties in Abbotsworthy, the village just to the south of Lovedon Lane. And you can see here that they were orientated perpendicular to the lane. And as I understand it, that was to do with practicalities. They were, when subsistent farming and market gardening were a key way of making ends meet, making sure that your plot was arranged practically to allow access and to allow the best growing for vegetables was key. So this is that one of those 2 properties, and on the right you can see the flank wall of the other property, and just that idea of a track that goes in front of the property, and your main elevation facing onto that was inspired, again, believe it or not, the typologies that we use to edge the south and the west elevations of the site. And you can see that grain appearing on this diagram. actually, I should have said right at the outset that BD Landscape were the landscape architects on this, and really this is a project about BD Landscape and John Pardee Architects. We work very closely together. Rob Bezic and I have worked on a number of projects over the years, but this is a project that is all about landscape and buildings and working together, and so they're really key, a really key part of the project. So this street section shows that view, shows how those views are achieved across that main lane through the site, with buildings creating gaps and allowing views both from in the site, from the meadow back into the site, but also looking the other way. This idea that wherever you are walking around the site or wherever you live, you are always aware of the landscape beyond. These are some plans of one of those typologies, open ground floors with a bay window overlooking the meadow, but your main openable window opening out onto an outdoor room, a terrace where you can eat. The garage closing the gap, but providing a rooftop terrace, which is a real sun trap on all of these houses, and is one of the great things that happens on this at Lovedon is that people gather on their terraces in the evening and call across the street or call down into the street. And most people have kept those bedroom twos as a second living space with a sofa bed, so that they can migrate to that room when it's the right time of the day. And this is Joe and Vicky enjoying their bay window overlooking the meadow. These are, apologies for these slightly cheesy marketing images, but shows the idea of a garden wrapping around two sides of the house and creating different characters. And then the terrace looking out to the South Downs, but also overlooking the street, so that you can watch life going by and strike up conversation with your neighbours. And then that, of course, then offers those views for the properties on the other side of the street out beyond the site. In terms of materials, we started with the brief that the buildings should be predominantly brick, and I think we all thought that they would be a red brick, that is the Hampshire brick colour. But as we explored that, it became evident that on such a visually prominent site, red was quite jarring, particularly early in the project's life, until the landscape had a chance to embrace it. So it was really visiting the site after they'd freshly ploughed the field that I took this photo and sent it to our brick supplier and said, can you give us a brick that matches the colour of the earth? And as you can see, we also took the inspiration from the flint blocks that you find in the fields to provide more homes for insects, masonry bees, sparrows and bats. Similarly, the tall pine trees that line the site provided inspiration for the timber cladding, the dark grey timber cladding that was provided by pivot au bois and that sort of vertical accentuation. The roofs were a key part in a rural landscape because of the distant views that you have of sites, and HAB were keen to maximise the solar potential of the roofs, but we took inspiration from this tradition on the left of roofs in Hampshire and Dorset, where a heavier material is often used at the eaves to resist the uplift from strong winds, and that that was a helpful device for arranging the solar panels as a full width array and then with a plain tile strip below. So that's the palette of materials. And one thing that almost everyone says when they visit the site and other residents within Kingsworthy is how successful the palette of materials have been. So we're really pleased that that has worked well. I mentioned the meadow earlier. That previously it was arable land that needed to have the topsoil stripped away so that it was suitable for chalkland wildflower, and that is obviously a fantastic asset for Kingsworthy and for the residents of Lovedon Lane. But one of the things I'm most pleased with is that we were able to introduce a lot of new hedging. We have dormice on the site, and we were really keen to provide hedges that provided a soft edge to the development, not just on boundaries, on the public boundaries, but also between plots, getting away from that ubiquitous close-boarded fence that most developers insist on using. But HAB were really keen to embrace this idea, and it has really is a strong part of the character of the development. The sense that you've got these buildings sat within a very verdant landscape. Finally, another feature that Rob Bezic and BD Landscape often introduce to schemes is seating. And in this case, just simple oak benches provided by a local timber supplier, raised off the ground by a couple of inches. But they're a really important part of helping to support and nurture the possibility of this new community. Places where people can come out with a cup of tea when the sun's beating down on their front elevation, spaces within the public realm. And basically every doorstep has one of these oak benches, so it's a really key part of the development. And within the green itself, bench where you can go and have a glass of Pimm's with a friend, and before you know it, there's 8 of you. I mean, to be fair, this was the summer street party, so I guess that's probably not always the case, but also a place where children can use a bench as a base for a game. And if that all gets too much, you can return to the meadow and find some solitude in amongst the flowers. So as Carlos said at the outset, that we were really delighted that Lovedon won a national RIBA award and was shortlisted for the Neve Brown Award. It also picked up the Outstanding Winner Award at the Landscape Institute Awards last year. And I think one of the things they wrote about it actually captures quite well what we sought to achieve and did achieve. In marrying the formality of residential development with freedom of nature, it creates the perfect place to live, play, and connect. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Carl. Fascinating project. I'm just kind of interested about the context of this. I mean, South Downs views, Winchester fringes. How much local resistance did this project get?
Very little, very, very little indeed. And that was in large part due to the public consultation that HAB did in the lead up to the site being allocated and identified. And without going into detail, there were challenges and difficulties for HAB during the process of this build. And things unraveled quite significantly, and so the actual delivery was extended over a longer period than anyone would have hoped for. But I think during the actual process leading up to planning, actually HAB did a really good job of bringing people on board and aligning support for the scheme.
And I mean, I really like some of the, I mean, obviously you really seriously considered this project. I mean, the perpendicular nature, the threshing barn, you've obviously been picking up on an awful lot of kind of vernacular precedents. Particularly lovely was that detail where you, because usually, things like, photovoltaics, can, if they're not designed, just look kind of piecemeally bunged on roof. The very idea that you kind of stretch them across the roof and somehow manage to kind of establish that connection between that and the vernacular tradition of kind of using heavier tiles at the end of the roofs, I think was really fascinating. Even in the detail, I thought you've been sitting there looking at things, really observing local architecture and kind of thinking, how do we kind of absorb this into a modern development? Yeah,
absolutely. And should say that John Hearn, who was the lead urban designer at Winchester City Council, was very involved with this project, and we had really good conversations about how you deal with things like photovoltaics, and we both landed on that approach. But yes, no, that's been, I mean, effectively the site, the development is a solar farm. There's a large battery store, which the electricity is controlled so that it can be sold to the grid, but allows all the residents to have a better access to the solar power that's provided. And obviously, it's we need to be integrating solar and other renewable technologies, even in these very visible sites. So thinking about how they're integrated. GB Sol were the provider of the photovoltaics, and they provide, and that is something they specifically do, is provide whatever size of array you want to suit whatever shape of roof you've got, which was great to find them.
Just quickly going through some of the comments. Conway says, thank you, Carl. I like the simple reference to the researched architectonic palette, which we just discussed, including the landscaping of the area. Is there an issue with stormwater drainage?
I could have talked about the SUD strategy at length. The whole site has got a series of SUD basins, including within that village green on the left, but also rainwater gardens running down the slope, and they all make their way to lower points within the site. So it's all managed through I can't remember is it blue infrastructure or blue-green infrastructure, rain gardens and swales and basins.
Roxanne Townsend asked quickly, what is the purpose of the solid sections to the window heads? I'm assuming that you can see them in that picture there. What's the purpose?
So really not, they were a nod to lintels. They're part of the Velfac window system, and it was just picking up on visual clues from the vernacular buildings that we were looking at, and the sort of relaxed fenestration, the way that windows are sort of put in as buildings evolve over their lifetime. So we did that in a couple of ways, with the Velfac panel above the windows, and also with sort of timber lintels by Pivot au Bois, who provided all the timber cladding, both for and also most of the timber within the landscape as well.
Bob Eden says, here we have a configuration driven by thoughtful typologies, but not to the extent that character is drowned by pastiche. Very refreshing. I'd echo that one. David and Jones says, beautiful development. And yes, and that's it. So it is a really beautiful development. What does it actually market for? I mean, what do these houses go for in this context?
Well, I can't remember what they were. Most of these were sold in 2016 through to 2018, but one of the larger houses recently went on the market for just under $1 million, I think.
Wow, yeah. I mean, it is an absolutely idyllic landscape, and it does really very much feel like the community there has established itself. The very fact that you could take photos and say, well, it was a summer party, admittedly it was a summer party, and you think, well, how often do streets have summer parties? I mean, the point that you know, that it obviously feels like that there's a community embedded there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, most of those are taken as stills from Jim Stevenson's films he produced for us, which can be found on our website. But that's worth having a look at if people want to see more of the scheme. Does a really good sort of navigation of the scheme.
Well, thank you very much indeed for your presentation, Carl. It's fascinating, lovely images. And I would recommend people going to the website and actually seeing Jim Stevenson's film. I'm sure it'll be beautiful. They usually are. Thank you very much indeed.
Great, thank you.
Moving swiftly on, running 15 minutes over now, to our final case study, which is the Gardenmore Green social housing development in Belfast. And presenting that is Chris McAvoy, who's project architect at Hall, Black and Douglas in Belfast. Chris is a project architect at Hall, Black and Douglas, designing and delivering housing, master planning, community and commercial schemes, most notably the firm's Alt Nagalvin Acute Hospital, which was nominated for the 2022 RIBA National Awards after receiving its regional award. Chris was project architect for Gardenmore Green, awarded Best Small Residential Housing Development at the 2022 UK Brick Awards. And his design skills have been recognised as a student, I'm assuming, with a nomination for the RIBA President's Medals as winner of the RSUA's Silver Medal in 2018. Gardenmore Green in Belfast is a high quality social housing development of 14 homes in a residential area with a sloping topography, changing 6 metres from the west to the east. This, combined with a variety of pitched roof structures, creates an interesting streetscape enhanced by pockets of landscaping of native trees, softening the boundaries of this development. And to pick up that story and tell us more about it, Chris, are you there?
Hi, Carlos.
Hello, good morning.
Morning.
Thank you for agreeing to do this presentation on Gardenmore Green. Take it away.
Okay, thanks, Carlos, for your very kind introduction, and also to the RIBA Journal for inviting the practice to speak at today's webinar.
Thank you.
So, I'm going to be discussing our Gardenmore Green social housing project. So just to set the context of the overall development then, so the scheme provided 14 social housing dwellings located in the west of Belfast. So the project was designed and delivered by Hall Black Douglas Architects for our client Radius Homes. Social housing is very much in high demand in Belfast, especially in the West Belfast area. So we were delighted to have the opportunity to try and ease that demand. This was the first scheme that we worked on of a social housing framework that we were appointed to complete over a 3-year period. And this scheme really set the precedent of design quality and design aspirations for the projects that followed. So the dwellings are designed to achieve lifetime homes and secured by design accreditation. And we also experience kind of very challenging ground conditions, and working with the existing topography was quite fun. So the project started in July 2020 and completed in March 2022. And generally as an office, our view on the scheme is that it's simple housing done well, with a key focus on the longevity and quality of materials and quality of living spaces. So the existing site is very much embedded within an established residential area in West Belfast. And this was a little diagram that we produced for the client just at the outset of the project, trying to highlight some of the site constraints and potential opportunities. So the site really benefits from existing amenity spaces to the east and also to the south. We also have a key boundary condition with existing 3-storey apartments just to the western boundary. So we were keen to make sure that that was softened through screening landscaping. And then also to the rear of the site, we had a copse of mature trees, which we were keen to celebrate within the new development. So this is the overall site arrangement, which was quite simple and efficient, but we had a keen interest in creating an active streetscape and also providing as much amenity space as possible for residents, and also looking to provide soft landscape boundaries to the edges just to soften the transition between the surrounding context and the development. As I'd said previously, we had lots of fun working with existing topography. We had a 5-meter level change from the western site boundary to the east. And it was a real challenge trying to get the levels to work to provide unit access from the roadway up into the dwellings. But that challenge also created a really great opportunity for us as architects to try and provide creative solutions, and also allowed us to create a very interesting step streetscape. So this is the southern bank of housing that we developed. And also thinking of kind of interesting ways to create retaining structures, but also soften the boundary between properties. So we looked at creating raised planters with boxes hedging in between, and also kind of pockets of landscape just in front of the retaining walls. Again, just trying to soften the impact of that whilst dealing with the levels. On the opposite side of the street then, we tried to separate the dwellings out slightly. So we created semi-detached and detached units, and that gave us the opportunity to kind of play with the roof forms. So we created almost a little row of gables, again, trying to create a really interesting streetscape experience. This is one of the housing typologies that we developed for the site, which we think was quite successful. So the ground floor arrangement, very simple in plan, but we were keen to create a kind of open plan kitchen, living, dining space, trying to provide as much natural light as possible through corner windows and also a glazing screen to the rear. We also had quite a lot of fun in carving out the front elevation and creating steps and a kind of cantilevered soffit, which created a kind of moment of shelter for residents as they entered the homes. Also a little single-story projection, which houses a universal access WC at ground floor level. So this is the housing typology as built then. So you think was quite successful? Just in terms of the material palette within the scheme, the main material that we used was buff brick. And we kind of seen that as a contemporary marriage of the red brick and buff render within the surrounding context, but breaking up the massing through kind of brick detail panels. Arriving home in the evening was a kind of experience that we really wanted to celebrate within the development. So we looked to provide recessed canopies, just a kind of moment of shelter for residents as they kind of fumble with their keys in the evenings, trying to protect them from the unpredictable Northern Irish weather. And then also looking to integrate brick feature panels, which give a kind of sense of tactility as you enter each home. Another detail that we looked to explore throughout the scheme was very simple, cost effective, but created a really kind of striking streetscape experience, was kind of projecting header courses. So we used that throughout. And then again, a kind of key focus on internal living spaces, trying to provide as much natural light as possible and views to gardens and also to the streetscape. So every dwelling was designed to achieve lifetime home standards, trying to kind of adapt to the future needs and mobility of residents when needed. Again, trying to introduce kind of areas of natural landscaping, little pockets of delight as you walk through the street and also live in your home on a daily basis. And just some of the success that the project has had within the last year. So we were delighted to pick up the Small Housing Development Award at the Brick Awards 2022. And finally, thank you for listening.
Thank you very much indeed, Chris. Could you just spell out for me, are all of these projects social housing?
Yeah, so each dwelling is social housing.
So what kind of budgets were you working to?
So I think the overall contract value was in the region of 1.8 million for 14 dwellings. Yeah. 1.8
million. So what was that per, how much approximately were you paying per square metre?
Well, I wouldn't have that figure to hand now. But yeah, we really did try and push the quality, you know.
Yeah, no, I can see that. I mean, in terms of your whole elevation, the whole kind of approaches you're having to kind of like bringing the building in and out, which obviously every time you do it, every time you're kind of creating another surface, you're kind of adding to the per square metre cost. So obviously very considered approaches to how you're going to do it. I mean, I think it's really effectively done. I really love the ideas of you creating the threshold, you know, the idea that people have got a really generous space to kind of stand and wait while they're getting their keys in the door. You know, all of those little things which are really, really important touches to, as you say, having a sense of welcome for the people who are actually living in the homes themselves. So I think that's a really kind of powerful, I think there's really powerful gestures. It's very strong. What's the context it's in? Because I'm looking at the houses around, I mean, this is an existing housing estate, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very well established residential housing area, mainly kind of 1970s red brick houses, which aren't in fantastic condition.
Yeah.
But we tried to kind of pick up on the existing context in terms of the roof pitches and also kind of that contemporary reference to the materiality as well.
And with the, I mean, I noticed that you, because obviously every time you're kind of, as I said, cutting in, I see you create those really nice brick soffits, which are obviously hung brick. Yeah. Was there a possibility you could have done it? Because I could see that the tarmac kind of goes all the way to the door. Did you ever consider trying to do brick? Or is that just in terms of budget was impossible to kind of, you couldn't kind of form an envelope of brick on all four sides?
I think we kind of had spent our budget.
Yeah, no, I can see.
The ground finishes. But yeah, I mean, it's something that we would kind of like to push in the future. But generally, we can be slightly restricted in terms of budgets for ground finishes. And I suppose we prefer to put that kind of money into the actual dwellings themselves.
Yeah. No, I can see that. I mean, what is that? Can you explain a little more about the space that kind of sits in front of the houses themselves? I mean, is that grass there? I can't quite see behind those low walls.
Yeah, so we have little grassed areas and then just landscaping and kind of small ornamental trees. Again, just trying to improve the streetscape experience and kind of soften that boundary.
What were the biggest challenges for you in terms of delivering this?
Well, the project program kind of ran the whole way through the COVID-19 pandemic, which was a challenge in itself, you know, especially trying to source materials, and there was delays to the program and things like that. But then also the kind of ground conditions, you know, the ground was very poor. We ended up with pile foundations in the end. And one day I actually lost my boot just in front of this house here because the ground conditions were so poor. But look, it was a great challenge trying to work with the topography. And I suppose it kind of pushed us as architects to design a creative solution.
And how are you dealing? Because obviously it's a very, like you said, it was kind of like a 6 meter drop across the site. Is that correct?
Yeah.
How are you then dealing with things like surface runoff? I mean, how was all that managed in terms of a drainage strategy?
Our drainage strategy was very kind of simple. We tried to fall everything just towards the roadway, and around the houses we had kind of little threshold drains as well, just to make sure that no water kind of penetrated into the building envelopes.
Did it require like a drainage pond at the end or some kind of water mitigation strategy?
No, we just tried to fall everything to the mains waters.
Yeah. Okay, so everything drains to the main. And how, I mean, I've got a question here. Bob Eden here says, the houses are beautiful, not a lot of space for on-site community space. Conway says, I know Peter Courtney saying, fantastic scheme and lovely detailing, but where are your bins stored? That's the thing, where are your bins stored?
Our bins are stored just behind our timber fences to the rear. So they're kind of hidden out of sight, just in the back gardens of the properties.
I see, so you drag them forwards on the day you're supposed to collect them.
That would be quite a standard procedure in Northern Ireland.
And Kathy Hines is asking, how affordable was that big brick tapestry effect that you adopted on the front elevations of the homes?
I think it's quite a cost-effective way of producing quite a striking impact. You know, it's really just kind of laying the brick in a certain way. Granted, the bricks had to be cut to create that. But in terms of kind of other decorative detailing that we could have looked at, it was quite cost-effective.
I mean, I like the way that you've kind of connected two homes. I mean, you could have made these distinct homes, you know, individual homes on the side. So what was that? What made you think of the idea of kind of creating this connection between the two? Why do it?
We thought it just created kind of more of a cohesive pair of houses. And there's also kind of a cost element to it as well. You know, semi-detached dwellings are generally kind of less expensive to build. And we had already had kind of 2 semi-detached properties either side of that. But yeah, we kind of really like that stepping element within the properties as well.
I think it's quite interesting the way you've adopted the two, because you both joined them and Stepman, so they're both distinct and also connected. And I think that's, you know, considering the budgets you are working to, the idea of actually kind of architectonically managing them, so you kind of create a cohesiveness or make them, or give them kind of a sense more grandeur in the way that in the old school that everybody was dealing with semi-detached houses way back in the early, you know, beginning of the 20th century. That idea that you kind of create more of a, you know, you make it look like a large grand home rather than the idea of 2 smaller ones, and it's kind of working to great effect here.
Thank you.
Where is our other? Yes, we've got that one about, what about community space? There was a question raised here about community space. How is that? I mean, you'd probably have to go back to the plan, but I wanted to see exactly, was there any requirement there for community space at all?
So within the kind of local context, there's quite a lot of green amenity space in the surrounding area. So we thought that the provision was probably more than enough.
Oh, yeah.
Almost like a kind of linear park that extends right the way down to the end of the road, and then also directly opposite. And I suppose when you're working with a social housing association, you know, efficiency in terms of site layout is very important. And if you have kind of green amenity spaces in close proximity to the site, then, you know, it kind of mitigates that need for community space within the actual development itself.
Yeah, the open space makes a massive difference.
Yeah.
Did you have any, I mean, given the fact that you were trying to detail them to this extent, did you get any kind of pushback from Radius as the developer, where they were like kind of like going, we think you're kind of overspending on details? I mean, was there a lot of discussions had about how you managed that as a design process?
Yeah, and I think what really helped was the fact that this was the first project within the framework. So we kind of sat down and explained the detailing and potential cost implications of that. But we were really keen to take the client on a journey to try and push the standard of social housing in Northern Ireland, and for Radius to kind of set that standard and for us to help them kind of achieve that.
Did it make, I mean, as you say, it was kind of a first project with them. So did you feel that it was very much for them that they had to kind of set themselves a standard so that they were perceived as delivering higher quality homes?
Absolutely. And I think within Northern Ireland, Radius would kind of have a reputation of pushing design quality and design aspirations. So we were delighted to kind of push that even further in this one.
Well, someone here is Phil Chaddick says £128,000 per unit gross seems good value for 3 beds with such design detail. Someone's been doing your maths for you.
He's a better quantity surveyor than I am.
Jamie here says, well done, Chris. Amazing to achieve that level of quality on a restricted budget. Thank you for upping the standards of housing in West Belfast.
Thank you very much.
A lot of positive feedback there. I know it's very challenging. I mean, you know, one does notice the kind of the levels of tarmac, you know, as it goes down there, and you kind of feel if there had been a bit more money spent, you know, if they'd given you more money, that you could have really worked with kind of you know, both not just on the homes themselves, but on the public realm. Although that said, I do like your balustrades there. But you can kind of sense that you would have probably worked into that landscape a bit more to kind of embed the houses more rather than having tarmac going by. But I mean, given that, I mean, look at those budgets. I mean, they're incredibly low.
Yeah. No, I think we kind of, you know, achieved quite a good standard of finish and detailing for the budget that we had. And absolutely, it would have been great to have nice brick pavers, you know, within the driveway spaces just to kind of soften that transition. But unfortunately,
no, I mean, it's totally acceptable. You've got to kind of decide what you're going to fight for and what you just have to let go of. Exactly. At that level of costing, those are just very key decisions you just have to take, you know, make a call on. Anna Williamson here says, I love the pairing, similar to terrace street ends with access paths behind. I'm calculating £1,600 per square metre. If each is 80 square metres, does that sound about right to you?
Yes, I think that the dwellings are probably around about 65 square meters to 80 square meters.
Okay, so it would be around that 1,700 maybe, but still very low.
Yeah, so we have a mix of 3-bed properties, 5-bed, and also 1 complex needs as well.
And Anna asks, have you had any more work from the same client?
Yes, so that was the first project on the social housing framework. So following that, we developed schemes of up to over 100 homes for Radius. So they've been a great client to work with. And
oh, right. So and clearly very happy with the work that you've been doing for them.
Yeah, well, we've had very positive feedback so far. So hopefully we can work with them again in the future.
I hope you do. Thank you very much indeed, Chris. Great presentation. Thank you very much for showing us Gardenmore Green. Now, where are we? 10 past 11. Oh, I think I've actually done quite well. I've managed to claw back 5 minutes. I'd like to thank everybody actually who's presented. I mean, it's been absolutely fascinating. It's been lovely going through these projects. It's kind of hard to kind of sum up. I mean, they're so kind of diverse in some ways, but I suppose what I would kind of take from it is, you know, having looked at you know, the Lansbury Estate, Dunboyne Road, Lovedon Fields, Masters Fields, Gardenmore Green. I suppose the messages that the presentations have kind of have told us is that I suppose it's not really so much about the housing itself, but how any housing manages to embed itself correctly within its landscape or context. All of them seem to do that in some way, shape or form. They're all attempting to bring the house, not just talk about the house itself, but to kind of embed that house within the landscape in which it's, or that housing within, to embed it within the landscape in which it sits. And I think that's, I suppose, is the really key thing. That's directly what the Lansbury Estate was trying to do, I suppose, you know, back way back in when it went up, was the idea that it was kind of the idea of creating a village, creating a sense of community. And I think all these examples here have been trying to kind of do that. Even with Gardenmore Green at the very end, the idea of bringing houses together to kind of take that semi-detached typology and bring them together is linking things which, you know, ostensibly in the modern day don't have any connection at all, as we see from the kind of noddy homes that one sees all over the country. It's about thinking intelligently about how you kind of create the critical mass to development. So I think all of these projects in some way, shape or form are trying to do that, to develop critical mass. And I think that's really how one starts to develop a sense of community. It only leaves me to thank our thoroughly engaging speakers as well today. It's been really lovely speaking to you. John Boughton, Honorary Research Fellow at the School of Architecture at the University of Liverpool. Remember to put in PiP 20 on your code if you're buying from RIBA Books, and you'll get a discount, and maybe put Municipal Dreams in there too, which is a great read. Thank you very much too to Holly Galbraith, Associate at Niall McLaughlin Architects, talking about Masters Fields. Carl Gulland, Project Architect at John Pardee Architects on Lovedon Fields, and Chris McAvoy of Hall, Black and Douglas talking about Gardenmore Green. Thank you very much indeed to all of you for your time and wonderful presentations. And last but not least, to our sponsor VMZinc and their speaker today, Jonathan Lowy, for a presentation which, judging by the number of questions that seem to have come out of it, there might well be a kind of rise in the value of zinc in the coming months. Thank you very much indeed to all of you for listening. I hope we haven't overrun too long, and I hope that you've been as engaged with the presentations as I have. Please bear in mind that we have our next PiP webinar on the 14th of March, which will be on the subject of education. And I hope to see you all there. Please join me then. Thank you very much indeed, and good morning.